And Job, the 33rd session. I started to say 33rd chapter, but it's session number 33, and we come to Job 39. I was just looking a little bit today by accident, really, to see when we started this, and I realized that it was almost a year ago, not quite a year ago, but it was the end of May that we started this. And I started to go back and watch the first session, but I was afraid to because I was afraid that I would catch myself in a lie, in which I think I might have told you we were going to have a summer series through the book of Job. And we are. It's just 2 summers. Actually, we are getting to the point where the pilot says, put your seat back up and your tray table back in its upright position and get ready for landing, because in 20 minutes, unless the air traffic controller causes us to circle around a little bit, we're going to land here one of these days, not tonight, but because tonight we're going to go maybe through chapter 40, verse 24, and there are 42 chapters altogether. But we're going to start tonight in chapter 39, verse 13. Last week, we went through verse 12, and you may remember that we talked about Yahweh, the Lord, who came, and now he was talking directly to Job, and he was basically saying, Job, I know you want to have a meeting with me, and good news, I've scheduled it. We're going to now meet face to face. And I mentioned that this fits everything that we have been surmising, is that the word I want? Theorizing, that Job represents the righteous remnant of the Jewish people in the end days, and they go through that time of persecution, and during that time, they cry out unto God, and they, in a sense, ask for a meeting with God, or we could say it a different way, they long for the judgment day, which is kind of what Job was doing. He says, I want to meet before God as judge, and let him give the judgment. So, now, God is in the introduction stages of giving the judgment. And remember that Job was very confident all along. And he kind of wanted to convince God that he needed to be judged righteously. Now, I don't think Job was wrong in that, even though it would be easy to get there. Job is we're even going to see tonight, Job decides, I think I'll just keep my mouth shut. Yes, it is a smart thing to do. But it's not because Job says, I was wrong, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. Rather, I think Job says, God is so much in the right that there's nothing I can add. There's no need for me to try to convince God of what is right because God already knows what is right. Now, what God, Yahweh here, has been doing is displaying his wisdom. Because Job's in a position where God doesn't seem very wise, if you will. Why, God, have you done this to me? I don't deserve this. I've lived in righteousness. And now, not only have you allowed all this trouble to come upon me, but you've also allowed me to have to endure 3 friends who think I'm in the wrong and listen through all of this. And so God comes and says, beginning in chapter 38, verse 1, where we started last week, he says, I am wise, let me give you some proof. And he went through several things where he was showing his wisdom, and that's really where we're going to pick up tonight. There are 4 more things left in this part of the speech where God shows his wisdom. And in chapter 39, verse 13 through 18, he shows his wisdom in the peacocks and the ostriches. How's that? And remember last week, he was showing his wisdom in the... Say that. Weather was one of them. Yeah, it's not the one I thought you would remember, but. The unicorn, you got it. Remember we talked about the unicorn last week, and he showed his wisdom in the unicorn. I won't go back through that whole thing. You'll have to go back and listen again if you missed it. But now we got the peacocks and the ostriches, verses 13 through 18, and we're going to start out just with verse 13. It says, God speaking again, gavest thou the goodly wings unto the peacocks, or wings and feathers unto the ostrich? Okay, did you give this? Goodly is is an archaic word. We don't use it much anymore. But it basically means beautiful, handsome, gorgeous, appealing to the eye. So, did you give the goodly wings unto the peacocks, or wings and feathers unto the ostrich? Now, he's going to talk more about this, but because Robin has a perplexed look on her face, we will go ahead and stop and discuss it. And Robin, you have a perplexed look on your face because yours doesn't say anything like that. Okay. And we miss you when you're gone, Robin, with your Sinner's Bible. But yours does not say anything like that. Yours says what? Okay, the ostrich's wings flap joyously with the pinions and plumage of love. Almost sounds like, I don't know, change it just a little bit and it can be like a Hallmark card or something. Such a sweet Bible you have there. Now, it says nothing about peacocks, does it? And the King James says nothing about love. So here, obviously, we got a bird and we got wings and we got feathers, right? Those do go together, and translations do vary very wildly. They vary very wildly. There on verse 13, and honestly, it is because this Hebrew in verse 13 is very difficult. In fact, I'll read from the United Bible Society Handbook for Translation. I mentioned this a couple of times before. United Bible Society leans a little bit to the left, I would say, but nonetheless, their handbook on translation gives a lot of linguistic issues, so I'll look into it and see what it has to say. And what they say on verse 13 is, the Hebrew text of verse 13a, that's the first part of verse 13, in the Hebrew text of verse 13a, there is nothing that is fully certain. How's that? In other words, we don't know what the first part of the verse says. And then, of the last part of the verse, it says, the second line is even more uncertain than the first line. So, there's nothing certain in the first line, and there's even less certainty in the second line. We have some Hebrew words here, several of which we do not know the meaning for the Hebrew words, and this is the only place that they are used, so there is nothing to compare to. And Hebrew is a language that, unlike Greek, where in Greek you can go and say, well, how did Aristotle use the word? Or how did Plato use the word? Or how did all these other Greek writings use the word? Well, in Hebrew, we only have the Hebrew Scriptures to go from. The Hebrew Scriptures are the basis of all ancient Hebrew writing, and so we just don't have anything to go on here. And so you've got peacocks. We've got peacocks. Robin doesn't have peacocks. Sorry, Robin. But we have peacocks. The word there is ranaim, and it has the sense, the root of it has the sense of, first of all, a shrill cry. Have you ever heard a peacock? They have a shrill cry. I remember I used to work down at the Cottonwood Ranch on the Rio Grande in Velarde when I was in high school. And they had peacocks. It was a beautiful place down there, by the way. You should go see it. And when I first got there, and the first time the peacock gave a shrill cry, I did too. I wasn't sure what was going on down there at that river, but nonetheless, they have this shrill cry. Now, that, along with the fact that it talks about these, again in English, goodly wings, which is beautiful feathers, I think is perhaps another way to translate it. So you got a bird with a shrill cry and beautiful feathers. I don't know. I think an ostrich, somebody help me out, I think they make more of a grunt than anything. Does anybody know? They spit. Somebody, where's that little thing you pull it and it says, the ostrich says. Anyway, I think that the King James Bible has said, we need something with a shrill cry and beautiful feathers. Let's go with peacock. The translators would have told you, we don't know if that's a peacock, but that's the closest thing we can come up to is being a peacock. Furthermore, it is evident that there are two birds in the Hebrew. And Robin, I think you only have one bird, correct? So an ostrich maybe kind of has these beautiful feathers, and maybe it even has a shrill cry, I don't know. But then they get to another bird, which is a different. Some of the translations actually put an ostrich and a hawk, I believe, because they know there are two birds, and I got to get two birds in there. Your New American Standard, is that what you have? ESV. New American Standard. New American Standard just went with one bird, and so again, I'll be kind of forgiving because the Hebrew text, the first line, there's nothing fully certain, and in the second line, there's more uncertainty. But I think two birds is a good thing here. Now, the reason I think King James went with ostrich on the second line, you probably never knew you would spend so much time thinking about peacocks and ostriches in church, did you? But the reason it went with ostrich the second time, again, we don't fully know what this second bird is, but we can look at the description, and what follows in verses 14 through 17 or 18 sounds like an ostrich. So we're going to go with a peacock, and then let's discuss the ostrich. Verse 14 is the discussion of the ostrich, and it goes mostly in verses 14 through 17, some negative characteristics of the ostrich. I'm going to say negative characteristics because they're presented in a negative light, and then turns that around in verse 18. But again in verse 14, this ostrich, which leaveth her eggs in the earth and warmeth them in the dust. That's what an ostrich does. Is just lay her eggs on the ground, often doesn't even make a nest for them, just right out in the open on the ground, and leaves them there. And verse 15, and forgetteth that the foot may crush them, or that the wild beast may break them. So the ostrich is not much one to, like most birds, that would lay the eggs in a nest and then sit on the eggs. Rather, she lays the eggs and then goes off and basically forgets them as the sun warms them. Verse 16, she is hardened against her young ones as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without fear. And again, this is somewhat of an ostrich is, have the egg, leave it out in the sun, it makes another baby, and mom doesn't care too much for it. And then in verse 17, because God hath deprived her of wisdom, neither hath he imparted to her understanding. Usually I think we would say maybe dumb as an ox, but maybe we ought to start saying dumb as an ostrich. Again, I think the writer, and there's a couple of ways to take that deprived, in which it very much sounds negative here. In the poetry of it all, you could probably just put that a little more positive. But as I was reading that verse, I almost thought of, how we used to kid people as when we were children and say, when God was passing out brains, you thought he said trains, and you said, no thanks, I'll drive. And this is kind of the joke that was given here is, hey, bird brain, you don't have much, the ostrich doesn't have much of a brain. And we even kind of make fun of the ostrich in this, especially if there's something ominous going on and we're living like there's nothing, then what do we claim that a person has done? Stuck his head in the sand, that's right. And we never even say ostrich typically, but when we say you stuck your head in the sand, we're saying you're ostrich-like. So I guess I've never been around too many ostriches. I don't really care to, I don't think, but I think we would probably be more impressed with the intelligence of other animals rather than the ostrich is the point here. It doesn't impress us yet, but yeah, it almost doesn't get there. In fact, it seems odd here. And there are a number of people, by the way, because it does seem a little odd, there are a number of people that think this section here was placed in later by someone else. And yet I think that when we come down, let's see, where was I? Verse 17, God deprived her of wisdom, neither hath he imparted to her understanding. But then it turns it around. And I think the point is in verse 18. So, in a sense, he's saying, boy, the ostrich, not a good mother, not a good student, but here's where the wisdom comes in, verse 18. What time she lifteth up herself on high, she scorneth the horse and his rider. Now, again, that's a poetic writing, but what it says is the ostrich is not a great student, and the ostrich is not a great mother, but don't get in a race with an ostrich. So he almost brings out the negative aspects. And again, I'm almost kind of hesitant to say negative because it is what it is. That's the characteristics of an ostrich. But he almost brings that out as a contrast to say, let me tell you what God has given her. And I actually did a little research on ostrich running and found out that an ostrich can run faster than a horse. As a matter of fact, an ostrich can run faster than a leopard. And so the ostrich is one of the fastest, if not the fastest animal of all of the creation. And so here's this, big kind of awkward bird that can't fly, and you don't want to, hire as a babysitter. But, if you need someone to run like the wind, hire the ostrich. And then he moves on to the horse, verses 19 through 25, which we're not going to spend much time on because actually verses 19 through 25 are let me say that a different way. As foggy as the verses about the ostriches and the peacock, we have the utter clarity about the horse. So there's not much need to spend much time on it because we'll understand it. Verse 19, hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him to be afraid of the grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is terrible. He paweth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goeth on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted. Neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage. Neither believeth he that it is of the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, Ha ha! And he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. Now, again, I think what you can say here is, hey, you want a war animal, you want an animal that's not afraid of anything, you want an animal that doesn't understand fear, take the war horse, basically, is what he talks about. And so here's God's wisdom, strength, power, might shown in the horse. And again, the whole point of this is to say, Job, be careful before you question too much about what I've done. And then we go on in verses 26 through 30. By an ostrich, that's right. Which kind of... Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a little bit of a contrast there, almost a little bit of humor there, that, he says, hey, here's this muscly beast that hath no fear, and the dumb ostrich can outrun him. And this is all put together in the wisdom of God. I don't think there is a prophetic point. Well, no, I'm gonna stick with that. Yeah, I don't think there's a prophetic point to this where you can tie this over into, say, this is where it is, say, in the book of Revelation. I think the prophetic point is in the overall speech in which God is now coming to judgment, and it is the introduction to say we have a just judge, a judge who knows what he's doing in all of this. So it's introducing the judge in his qualifications, if you will. We today, if the judge comes in, all we do is say, all rise. And yet here is the hear ye, let me tell you about the judge, so to speak, as it comes through there. No, because you're taking verses 11 and 12 out of context, because will you trust him is not will you trust God, it's will you trust the unicorn. If we'd like to sing Kumbaya, it would be a great way to do it. uh, so the hawk and the eagle, beginning in verse 26, 26 through 30, doth the hawk fly by its wisdom and stretch her wings toward the earth? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command and make her nest on high? Again, Robin, do you have hawks and eagles or do you have something else? Hawks and eagles, okay. Oftentimes I would say, unless it's a very common animal, some of these Hebrew words for animals are difficult. We have to go by the description, as we'll see here in a moment. Verse 28, speaking of the eagle, she dwelleth and abideth on the rock, upon the crag of the rock, upon the strong place. From thence she seeketh the prey, and her eyes beheld afar off. Her young ones also suck up blood where the slain are. There is she. Now that's not a very pretty picture, is it? But it speaks, of course, of the fact that these are vulture-type animals. And it says, where's the verse there? Let's see. Luke 17:37. I won't look that up. But at the end there, her young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there she is. If you look up sometime Luke 17:37, Jesus said, on the battlefield where there are dead, there the eagles gather together. And so where there's a field of blood because of the battle, there you're going to get the eagles and the hawks and all those kind of animals that are going to come in there. I have the feminine also. Oh, yours is masculine. Oh, okay. It's interesting. I know that I did not check all the way through, but I checked at the end of verse 30, where the slain are, there is she. The 1611 King James actually says, there is he. But I looked in the Hebrew, and I didn't follow through to see if there was a Hebrew variant here. Very rarely are there. And the Hebrew was clearly feminine. And 1611 King James clearly had a masculine in that particular verse. I used my phone a friend card and called an expert on 1611 versus 17 something or another King James, and he said the original was probably something like a printer error, and they went. But I need to look into that because I do clearly have the feminine there, which in the Hebrew word I looked up was feminine. You're welcome. Chapter 40, verses 1 through 5. We've ended now, God shows his wisdom. And this whole list of things, God shows his wisdom. Now, Job is going to have an opportunity to respond. And so it says, moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Now, the way that's translated might be right, but the way that's translated sounds kind of scolding, doesn't it? Now are you ready to speak to me? And I understand there's somewhat inherent in that, but for example, Young's literal translation says in verse 2, is the striver with the mighty instructed? Right at the beginning there. So, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct? Notice it says him. Him is inserted by the translators. It can go either way. If you want to stick in the him there, that is, hey, Job, you've contended with me. Do you now want to instruct me? I think the Young's is a little closer to the Hebrew from what I can tell on it, and it says, is the striver with the mighty instructed? That is to say, okay, Job, have you now learned anything? I've been just giving you all this display. Have you now learned anything? And that word contendeth, he that contendeth with the Almighty. By the way, remember, Israel means what? Yeah, one who strives with God. And so Job comes. Now it doesn't use the word Israel here, but it's this one who contendeth with the Almighty. Now, if you look up that Hebrew word for contend, it is very much a judicial word. So Job has said, I would like to have my time before the judge. So it's contending in that judicial kind of sense there. And then it goes on to say at the end of the verse, he that reproveth God, let him answer. Well, that's also a judicial kind of word. Reprove is not a word we use outside of the Bible much, but it is, the RE part is an emphasis, and prove. Therefore, reprove is to lay out all of the evidence and let it speak for itself. So, Job, you wanted to have an audience before God. Have you learned anything? And do you have all the evidence laid out to carry out your case that is there? As a matter of fact, that word reproved, as you see on the outline, Job 9:33, it's translated convinced. And no, Job 32:12, it is convinced. So, are you ready to convince God? Or it's translated in another place as a daysman, which is another word we don't use, but it's an arbitrator, a lawyer type of a word there. Now, Job comes with the answer, verse 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile, insignificant. As much as this pains me, I am going to say that the word means insignificant. There is not in this word, in this Hebrew word, there is not an inherent evil nature which we would use with the word vile. I didn't go back to see the English history of the word vile to see what it meant in 1611, for example. Very well could have not had the vile nature that it has today. But basically he says, he comes... I always stop myself mid-sentence, don't I? The reason that I am uncomfortable with the word vile is because, as I've said about 10,000 times through the series, I read chapter 1. And chapter 1 is Job is innocent. And all the way through, Job says, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. So can he come now and say, behold, I'm vile? If so, that means I have been wrong all the way through, and God was wrong at the beginning because he called me perfect. So I'm uncomfortable with that translation vile as it means today in 2019. Again, I don't know what it meant in 1611, but the Hebrew word does mean insignificant, small, of little account, and really he says, okay, yeah, I'm tiny. And so, behold, I am of little account. What shall I answer thee? Basically, he says, yeah, God, you have the wisdom. You're going to give the right judgment. I don't need to reprove anything. I don't need to convince you of anything. You've got this together. So then he says, I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. That is, by the way, a very good thing for all of us to realize from time to time, isn't it? How insignificant we really are. Not in a sense of low self-esteem kind of thing. I remember hearing a sermon one time. I may have told you about it because I've only listened to actually like 4 sermons. Fell asleep through the rest of them and was glad I was a preacher and didn't have to sit there and listen for a whole hour. But I remember a sermon one time that the guy was talking about, you know, how petty we are before God, how small we are before God, and how sinful we are before God. And he just, you know, pushed that and pushed that and pushed that. This is kind of what Calvinists do. You know, you're just absolutely scum of the earth. And I remember him calling us cockroaches. We're like cockroaches. And someday God turns on the light and we're all gonna flee. And even at the time, I thought, I don't know if that's really the way God looks at us. But it is sort of a popular idea. Remember Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hand of an angry God, and sort of holding them over the fire, almost with an evil Dr. Jekyll kind of laugh, just waiting to drop us into the fire. Well, I think that what we have here is totally different. It is a smallness, recognizing our place, and recognizing our lack of wisdom and understanding. And the older I get, the more I have come to say, I don't know. I notice this a lot in Ask the Theologian. They write in questions and I answer them, and my answer 3/4 of the time is, I don't know. I think I quote that verse of Paul more than any other verse. Now we see through a glass darkly, then we shall see face to face. Now we walk by faith, then we shall walk by sight. And there is something to maturity, I guess you could say, that does bring you to the point of saying, I didn't realize how much I didn't know. And so I think this is what Job is saying here in a positive, not a sinful way. He's saying, I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Verse 5, he says, once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Now, that's a little bit of Hebraism you find several times, once, yea, twice. And it's a way of saying, there was a time when I did say such and such, or I would have said such and such, but repeatedly in the past, I may have asked to speak to you, but now I realize that you don't need any education. You don't need my insight. You don't need my wisdom. You've got this together. And he recognizes the wisdom of God and the shrouded nature of his own thinking. Now, the Lord picks up, so Job says he doesn't want to say anything, and so the Lord comes back in beginning in verse 6, going through chapter 42, verse 6, which we're not going to get all the way tonight, but going through chapter 42, verse 6, he comes with now his second speech. And his second speech really is the display of God's divine power. In the first speech, he was displaying his wisdom. Now he's going to display his power. And he starts out, first of all, doing it generally. Later on, he's going to do it more specifically. Let's look in verses 6 through 13 and just get a hint of this general display of his power. Then answered the Lord out of the whirlwind and said, gird up thy loins now like a man. Remember, that's how he started the first speech. I will demand of thee and declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God? Canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud and abase him. Look upon everyone that is proud, bring him low. Tread down upon the wicked place, hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces as secret. We're going to stop there. Well, we're not going to stop there. I don't want you to misinterpret that. I'm not going to say a lot about these verses. Really, he's displaying his power and his strength in some pretty general manner, and I want to look more into some of the specific manner in which he displays his power and strength, beginning in verse 15. But first of all, verse 14, Then will I confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. Now, basically what he says in verses 6 through 13, he gives a challenge to Job and says, can you understand this? Can you do that? Can you disannul my judgments? Can you condemn me? Do you have an arm like me? A number of things that are kind of a challenge to Job. And then he comes in verse 14 and he says, if you can do any of the above or prove any of the above, then I will confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. Now, think about that. First of all, is there anything that you and I can do to save ourselves in a spiritual sense? No. We're wholly dependent upon God. And yet, if we could totally figure God out, and we could have the strength and power and might of God, then basically what God says is, then I'll let you save yourself. And that's really what it would come to. If I could be God, then I could save myself, right? And that's what he says to Job. And again, you put that in the sense of the judgment day that is to come at the end, and you have this picture of God displaying his divine power. And he says, picture Jesus at the judgment of the nations, maybe. And you got, the valley of decision. And he says, now, can any of you disannul my judgments? Can any of you condemn me? Do any of you have an arm like God? Are any of you decked out with majesty and excellency and array thyself with glory and beauty? Think of the kings of the nations out there. And he's sort of going through and he's saying, if any of you can match me, then I'll let you save yourself. Is there anyone who would like to step forward? Anyone? Bueller? And nobody steps forward. So this is the picture again that's given. Then in verse 15, we have the beginning of an interesting subject. It says, behold now who? Behemoth. Behold now behemoth. And behemoth is hippopotamus, dinosaur, large. How did you get a hippopotamus? Okay. Yours has it as a footnote. New American Standard has, okay, as a footnote. Okay. There are some who say hippopotamus. I think it's totally wrong, as I'll try to display here in just a moment. And I'm actually, just to cut to the chase, I'm gonna end up with dinosaur, I think. But the truth is, it's a behemoth. And so we have this behemoth that is given to display God's power. Because down in verse 19, we'll read these in a moment, but in verse 19, he that made him. Okay, I took that totally out of context, but basically what it says is God made behemoth. So it's going to take this behemoth and say, look at the power and the might of the behemoth. Don't you think the creator of the behemoth is even bigger than that? And that's the whole point of the discussion here. But in the end, the identity of the behemoth is unknown, and therefore, unlike last week, remember last week we had unicorn? And we took a Hebrew word, reem, that we didn't really know what the word reem was, and it became unicorn. Why didn't the King James do the same thing here and make the behemoth, let's say, a dinosaur? Why didn't they translate it dinosaur? That's right. So you're exactly right. So in the word reem, we had a little bit of something to go on, extra biblical nonetheless, but we had a translation of the Hebrew. In the Septuagint, they went with behemoth. So the Septuagint doesn't give us any help here like it did there, and so the Latin version went with behemoth, and the English version went with behemoth. There's, by the way, a very good reason why they didn't use dinosaur, and that's because the word dinosaur did not exist in 1611 when they did it. A modern translation, since about, 1850s, 1840s maybe, has the English word dinosaur been a word. So modern translations could have used dinosaur, but modern translations don't tend to believe in dinosaurs or have, whatever, so they didn't. But what is it? Again, bottom line is, it's a behemoth. That's what it is. So what the translators did was coin an English word. And it is an English word now, behemoth, right? It's not the first time you've heard that. And it's from the Hebrew word behemoth. And that is I believe it's the plural feminine behemoth. So we just made this English word. By the way, there's only a handful of English words that have Hebrew roots. There's a few. Most of them are just actually Hebrew words, like amen, hallelujah, seraphim, Selah, however you pronounce that. Nobody really knows. There's a few, not many. Alex? Yeah, interesting. A number of things that could have come in there in some way. Yeah, with behemoth, let's go ahead and read some of the characteristics here, and some do say it's a hippopotamus. That's just because a hippopotamus is big. And some of the other characteristics maybe kind of look hippopotamus-like. But verse 17, he moveth his tail like a cedar. That doesn't fit a hippopotamus at all. If you remember, the hippopotamus, has a little tiny tail. I think we have to discount hippopotamus. But nonetheless, let's read about the behemoth now. The behemoth which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Okay, there's one thing we know about him. He's a grass eater. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force in the navel of his body. Let's just say a strong torso that he's got there. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. He's got powerful tail, powerful legs. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like brass of iron. He's got a powerful bone structure. Verse 19, he is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword approach to him. We're going to come back to that verse because there's some interesting things in there. But I want to start with the first part of that anyway. He is the chief of the ways of God. Robin, does yours say chief? The first, okay. As you know, chief, even in the King James, even when Paul says, I'm the chief of sinners, we've talked about that before. It's the word protos, which prototype, it's really the word first. And here, chief is also the word that chronologically means he's first. Now that's interesting to me because look, if you don't mind, to Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, or I'll just read it to you because I know how to find the book of Genesis. 1 verse 24 says, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind. Now, that word living creature there is the singular masculine form behemoth. So let the earth bring forth behemoth. Interesting that is the first thing that God mentions when he's talking about the creation of the land animals, is the behemoth. Here, I guess they could have translated it, behold the living creatures, but he's very specifically talking about a living creature. And I think when you read Genesis 1:24, then he goes on and talks about cattle and the other things that we know exactly what they are. So isn't a cattle a living creature, right? I think that you can make a good argument anyway that Genesis 1 verse 24 says, let the earth bring forth the dinosaur and the cattle, and here he says, and the dinosaur is the chief of the ways of God. We'll come back to verse 19 in a minute. Verse 20, surely the mountains bring forth food when all the beasts of the field play. He lieth under the shady trees in the covert of the reed and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him about. Obviously gives a picture here of an animal at rest, if you will. Verse 23, behold, he drinketh up a river and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. A couple of interesting things about that. One is obviously he drinks a lot, a large volume of water, but the second is it mentions Jordan, which helps us to place the whole story of Job, because we know where the Jordan River is, and it's always been in the same place. And there, as far as anybody is aware anyway, there's never been hippos in the Jordan. And those who take this is another one of those passages that some people say this was added in later. It doesn't belong here. But if it's a hippopotamus, then there are those who say, well, the whole story happened down by the Nile, because that's where you'd find all of this. And it kind of takes it out of the picture of even, remember we talked about the Shuhite and the Elamite earlier on, that really does kind of place it in the ancient Middle East. So here we've got a little placement issue. And then in verse 24 is somewhat difficult Hebrew. He taketh it with eyes, his nose pierceth through snares. I looked at the Hebrew some trying to come out. I in the end, like Darby's translation, shall he be taken in front? Will they pierce through his nose in the trap? It's kind of a question. To say, hey, anybody want to go up and just put a hook in his nose and draw him along? You're going to make that your captive animal. No, nobody's going to do that is the implication. Now, I think that as Nicholas helped me with my dinosaur names this afternoon, Brachiosaurus. If you look up Brachiosaurus, he kind of fits this description here. Then interesting, to go back to verse 19, he's the first of the ways of God, and then it says, he that made him can make his sword to approach him. What's that mean? That means, yeah, God can slay him. That's exactly right. Or, in the words of Bill Cosby, whose name we're not supposed to mention anymore, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of this world. All of that is somewhat interesting to me, because even though it's a little cryptic, it really is maybe saying, Job, you, having lived so early on, you might not remember the dinosaur, but your grandfather's grandfather had stories of the dinosaur, and he doesn't exist anymore. And this behemoth creature that you still have a vague memory of,